Hey, what's up, everybody? Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. What I have for you today is a little two-part series that I'm doing on blind versus blind play, and also I'm doing something else a little bit different, as you can probably tell from the video. You're going to get to see my beautiful mug throughout the entire video. I think it's a nice little instructional tool. You see my face as I'm talking here, so hopefully that's not too distracting for you. If it is, let me know. I'll be sure never to show my face again. But what we have today, as I said, blind versus blind play. In part one, we're going to talk about playing out of the small blind. Part two, we're going to talk naturally about playing out of the big blind. Now, blind versus blind play is something that I really think is overlooked a little bit. Let me jump to the next slide real quick. And I think it's extremely important. But as I said, it is definitely overlooked because pretty much what blind versus blind play has become is push or fold in most sit and go formats. If you're not shoving all in, if you're a little bit too deep, it's not really discussed much in terms of what you should do based upon the different players. So what we're going to talk about today is essentially why is blind play so important, and when we are playing in the small blind, it really matters who's in the big blind. So we have to determine who are we playing against. Are we playing against regs, ABC regs, aggressive regs, loose passive, loose aggressive, random players. We're going to get into each player type, and we're going to talk about how to identify those players, what type of stats they have, and how to exploit those stats. Now, as I said, is that small blind is pretty important, and I actually wrote a blog article on this concept. But the reason that it's so important and the reason that we want to get it right is because it occurs so frequently. I mean, think about in any session that you're playing of 10 tables, 12 tables, 20 tables, how often you're in blind versus blind play. And because it happens so often, if that's a leak, if that's something you're struggling with, the cost of that poor blind play or that leak gets magnified over all those tables that you're playing. So something that might be really small, like a leak that might seem really small, is going to be magnified. It's going to be compounded. It's going to become a huge error potentially. You know, when we talk about mistakes, we always want to talk with our friends, our other poker buddies on Skype or whatever. We'll talk about the hand we got busted out on, and maybe it was like some unique 3-bet, 4-bet scenario. What should you have done here? Should I have called the 4-bet, or whatever the situation may be? Usually there are topics of discussion that can go on for a while, and they might be interesting, but those types of mistakes might be situations that don't happen very often, maybe once a week or something like that. While you want to get them right and they're fun to have a discussion about, they're not, those types of mistakes really aren't going to determine a winning versus losing player or increasing your ROI a ton. A simple small blind play scenario, maybe you fold it 9-4 suited out of the small blind when you should have shoved all in. Now, if you're going through and reviewing your game, that's probably not a hand you're going to talk with a bunch of your poker buddies, but in terms of what you should do. You had a 9-4 suited in the small blind with 10 big blinds, you might just say fold and move on and not think that that's a big deal. But if we find out that that 9-4 suited hand was extremely plus EV to play, and you're not playing that type of hand in that situation over 20 tables a day, 100, 150 situations a week, that becomes a lot of missed value. So the cost of poor blind play, as you see here, like I said, is really magnified. So we got to make sure we get it right. And essentially, playing out of the small blind allows you to be picking up chips instead of giving them away. If you've seen my 5-part sit and go series that I did, the next level of sit and go play, I talk about how I want to start picking up chips from 15, 30 level all the way through. All the way throughout the game. The more chips you have, the more maneuverability you have, the easier it is to exploit players, come in first place just by naturally having a bigger stack. So blind play is crucial in that attempt to constantly be building your stack more than the other players around you. And really, I really wanted to do this blind versus blind series because optimal strategy is typically misunderstood. There's really a ton of value because what everybody talks about is, once you get down to 12 big blinds, it's all in or fold, all in or fold. We can do so much more than that. And that's what I want to discuss with you guys today. So, when you're in the small blind, what I want you to stop doing is clicking the auto fold button, because that means you're just not giving yourself a chance. As I said, there's more to just pushing or folding. There's more than just your cards. We want to exploit the players. But first, you need to ask yourself, every time you're in the small blind, who's to my left? Is it a reg? Is it a fishy player, a really bad player that does a lot of wacky stuff? Or maybe it's just simply an unknown player. You haven't played against them before. You don't have a lot of stats on them. So once you identify that player, obviously we want to know what the effective stacks are. Your effective stacks will determine fold equity, situation. It's pretty straightforward. Now, number 3 here, as you see, is a really, really key concept that you need to always have in the back of your head. And I have this. This is the question I'm always asking myself, even when I'm in other positions at the table and not just the small blind. Is the player that's in the big blind capable of calling your raise? If you have 14 big blinds or 12 big blinds or 10 big blinds and you just raise, is the big blind capable of flatting that raise? Now, who are the players that are capable of calling a raise? They're typically those fishy, crazy players or unknown players. Regs, as we know, based upon your standard sit and go strategy, for the most part you should not be calling raises. That's just something we know, we've learned. So if you have a reg in the big blind, typically you're not going to be typically they're not going to be calling a raise. So that concept of who's going to be capable of flatting and who isn't is going to be really key in determining what our strategy should be in the small blind. And accordingly, once we identify these players, we can also use the stats to help us with very specific details about their game. Are they 3-betting often? In my HUD, and again, if you want to remember what my HUD looks like, we're going to show a quick hand here in a second, but you can go back to part 1 of my sit and go series where I talk about my HUD setup, and one of the stats that I have in there is 3-bet versus steal. So how often are people 3-betting versus steal? Typically, if the 3-bet versus steal stat is over 10%, that's your more aggressive opponent, and that number might actually be higher in the small blind or in the big blind as well. And for you guys using Hold'em Manager 2, what's really nice is there's a 3-bet versus hero stat. We'll get into exploiting and how players might perceive you in a couple minutes, but if you're using Hold'em Manager 1, I don't think Poker Tracker has it either, but I use 3-bet versus steal. If you're using Hold'em Manager 2, there's a 3-bet versus hero to determine how wide somebody might be 3-betting you. So that's a great stat to have. Are they a loose passive player, loose aggressive player? We'll get into how to deal with each opponent. And also, where are you at in the game? This, along with effective stacks, certainly determine your strategy many times. Are you pre-bubble? Are you an 18-man game and you're not even on the final table yet? Are you right on the bubble of a 9-man, of a 45-man? Or are you in the money? And in the money stack distribution, or in the money payout, will, along with stack distribution, will also determine your strategy as well. So let's get into how to identify certain player types and the strategy we should use against them. So the first player type is somebody I call the ABC reg. And let me just point this out. There's nothing wrong with being an ABC reg. Most players out there are ABC regs. With that being said, we can typically... Now, let's get into some player types, how to identify them, the strategies used against them. And the first player type that I want to discuss is the ABC reg. Now, there's nothing wrong with being an ABC reg. When I say average winning player, that might sound like demeaning. That's not really what I mean at all. Because most winning players are your ABC regs. They know the basic strategy. They know a really good push-fold game. They probably have a pretty good ROI. Probably not the top of the ROI range, but a pretty good ROI. You'll typically have your standard stats that you might expect from a reg. Somebody playing like 14-12, 13-11 type of stats. They're not really aggressive with their 3-bet versus steal. They're folding versus steal. They're not defending a ton. As I mentioned before, these are players that aren't going to be flatting our all-in or flatting our raise, and essentially what these stats are going to tell us about the ABC reg is that they really don't exploit. They're not going to exploit our play. If you get 3-bet by one of these players, it's typically by a pretty good range. They're not 3-betting ultra wide to exploit you. They're usually done by, as I say here, their value hands. And 3-betting ranges are typically equal to or close to the all-in calling range. And we'll get into how that'll be useful in 1 second. So we want to get into now the strategy about if you identify an ABC reg that is in the big blind, how should we play against them? So the key concepts to keep in the back of your mind about how to play against them is that, one, they're never going to exploit us. So accordingly, we should always look to exploit them. So how can we exploit them? Quite simply, the way to exploit them is, because we know, one, they're not going to flat, two, they're not going to exploit, meaning their 3-betting range is typically not going to be too wide, is that once we get to the big blind 50 area plus, so we're at 2550, 5100, and with greater than 8 big blinds or more, my default play is to raise 2.2 to 2.5x out of the small blind with any 2 cards. Now I know at 2550 regs are capable of flatting because a raise still doesn't necessarily represent a large portion of their stack. There's still a little bit more maneuverability, but for the most part, until I realize that somebody's capable of doing something different against me, especially an ABC reg, I'm looking to steal. I need a good reason to fold. I could care less about my cards because, since these ABC guys, they're not going to flat us very often, you're not going to be playing post-flop. So what's the difference between King 7 or King 10, King Deuce, and Deuce 7 if you're not going to play post-flop? There really isn't a whole lot of difference. If you have King 10, you raise, somebody 3-bet jams you for 20 big blinds, you're not calling the all-in. Just as you're not going to do the same thing with Deuce 7. So what we can start doing now is raising with any 2 cards and calling off with the appropriate range. And that's essentially how we exploit it. We'll get into some calculations here in a second. But one thing here you might have noticed is that I said raise with 8 big blinds. And most of you are probably thinking that's crazy. You've all probably turned into, if you hear this, you might want to turn into the grumpy cat real quick, which is my favorite meme, I guess you should say, at the moment. Grumpy cat's hilarious. But, don't become this guy. When I do coaching sessions, when I do sessions with the guys that I'm staking and doing hand history reviews, and I start talking about, hey, we can raise here with 8, 9 big blinds, you think I'm crazy, and you don't want to do it, because it's so counterintuitive to what you've been taught with sit and go play. So what I'm going to show you is why we can do that. So hopefully by the time we're done some hands here and some calculations, you're not going to be this grumpy cat anymore. So we'll get into some examples here in a second. So as I said, yes, versus these ABC tight regs, it can be and usually is more profitable to play a more raise fold, raise call game instead of just playing push fold with 8 to 12 big blinds. So if you need more of an explanation on this, part 4 of my sit and go series really goes into some calculations. We're going to do one quick one here. If I go into depth like I did before, this video will be about 2 hours. So I'm going to use one example, and then to get more calculations, go refer back to volume 4 of my sit and go series. So right now we're going to talk about the 8 to 12 big blind area, and specifically the 10 big blind shove. But when we are deeper, 13, 14, 15 big blinds, don't be afraid to just raise. So many times I see guys fold, and I ask why they're folding. Well, it's not a good hand. Well, if you're sitting there at big blind 100 and you in the big blind have 1500 stacks, first of all, you need to ask yourself, what's that 3-betting range of the big blind? Is it more of a value range? And the way you can determine that is put yourself in that big blind's position. Does he assume a lot of fold equity? And usually the lower the amount of fold equity you can assume based upon the effective stacks will determine how wide the 3-betting range is. And the lower that fold equity gets, perceived fold equity, the more tight 3-betting ranges will get, and so they'll become more value hands. But point is, if you're sitting there with 15 big blinds and the big blind has 15 big blinds, and you're sitting there with deuce 7, just don't fold. Raise. You're not going to play post flop. That's the key. You're not playing post flop. When you're not playing post flop, again, if you had king 10 with 15 big blinds in the small blind, I bet you would raise. You probably wouldn't shove 15 big blinds, but I bet you would raise. But you're also not going to call the 3-bet shove. So if you're going to raise with king 10 but not call the 3-bet shove, then what's the difference between king 10 and deuce 7? One difference is, I will admit, is that you have a king, so it's a blocker card essentially. But for the most part, that's kind of insignificant for our purposes and what we're trying to do. Go ahead and raise with any 2 cards. What I'm about to show you, the calculation for 10 big blinds, you can use that concept for 12, 14, 15 big blinds. Because if you know it works for 10, it's going to work for 13, 14 big blinds. So have the confidence to open up with any 2 cards when there's an ABC reg to your left. You should only stop doing that once you think that they adapt to you. One thing I will say, 95% of players will not adapt. They will not exploit. And again, go back to episode or volume 4 to show how wise someone have to 3-bet you to exploit to make these any 2 card opens not profitable in the long run. But let's jump right now to an example and let's set it up. So here's what we have is a 9-man game, and it's a 10 big blind situation. As you see here, I'm playing on merge. I'm sitting with 9-4 suited in the small blind, essentially 10 big blinds, versus this player here, Oswego Otter. I know him well. I have him on Skype. We talk pretty often, and so I know he's a reg. He's a very solid player. And as you can see here from the stats, now he's playing 22-19. That's definitely more aggressive, not your average reg. But more importantly, 1, I know he's a reg. 2, this 83 number here, if you follow my cursor, that's his fold versus steal. This 6.9 is his 3-bet versus steal. So in this situation, he's not really overly aggressive. So instead of me shoving all in, the question I want to ask is, can I just raise? Now, you're going to be faced with obviously three choices here. You could fold, you could raise, you could shove all in. So let's forget about folding. Now, there's people, let me just back up real quick. I've brought this situation up before, and there's people that said, well, just fold it. You know, he's a reg, he knows I'm a reg, he'll know you're shoving wide, so he'll call wide. That might be true. Some players will call wider than others. For our calculations, we're going to take an average calling range. Now, if he's calling ultra wide, sure, folding may be better than just shoving all in. But let's take a look at, based upon different ranges, what the optimal strategy is. So 9-4 suited, in general, is with 10 big blinds in a 9-man game. It can be an 82-card shove, and that would be a profitable shove. So what I did was I just took a screenshot of this situation in Sit and Go Wizard, and what it says is if I give Oswego Otter here about a 22.6% calling range. So if I shove all in, he's going to call with any ace, pretty much any pocket pair, down to I think it was like Queen Jack suited, King Jack off, with that type of range. Given that type of range, so as you see here, if you look right here at the differential percentage, the 0.25, the 0.25 is essentially our plus EV percentage. So we're going to win 0.25% of the prize pool every time we make this shove. So if you're reviewing your game and you see that this is a plus EV shove, you're going to go on your merry way and think this is a very good play. And based upon his calling range, we could shove about 75% of hands, and 9-4 suited's in that range, and it's a plus EV play. That's the point. Now, you might say, is this range wider, tighter than that? If it's tighter, we can start shoving 82 cards. If it's wider, then we would probably have to tighten up our shoving range. But I think that range is a pretty good average range for another reg calling it all in versus another reg in a 9-man game. So this is the plus EV shove with 10 big blinds. This is what everybody knows. You know, this is the hot topic of, you know, we need to put this in Sit and Go Wizard or whatever tool you're using to determine if it's a plus EV play. And it is plus EV. Don't get me wrong. This is a profitable play. The question is, do you want to make a profitable play or do you want to make an optimal play? And by optimal, I mean just simply make more money. Let's take a look at what I did and determine if this is the optimal play. So as you can see here from the hand history, I didn't shove all in. I raised to 350. People might think that's crazy. Why would you raise to 350, a little bit more than a min raise? Let me say one thing, guys, real quick. When I'm in the small blind, I don't min raise. I always raise like 2.2 to 2.5. I think it's way too easy for people to flat. Even regs might flat because the min raise is just so cheap for them to call out of the big blind. It's easy for one, them to flat. Two, you're giving them a little bit more room to 3-bet. So you want to be a little bit careful. If you find yourself min raising out of the small blind, I don't have the numbers to support it saying every time I min raise, this is how many times I get flat or 3-bet every time I raise to 2.2. In my opinion, I've done literally thousands of hand history reviews with players I've coached, staked, maybe not thousands, hundreds. So saying literally thousands might be an exaggeration, so not exactly literal. But you know, I'm staking over 50 guys at the moment, so I'm always doing hand history reviews. And from what I've seen, just raise more than a min raise. Min raise just gets called so often, or 3-bet on so often. So I always make it a little bit bigger than a min raise to maybe increase my perceived fold equity and minimize chances of somebody flatting. But that's my little public service announcement for not doing a min raise. But in this situation, as I said, I'm just raising. Now we have to figure out, is this play better than shoving? And Now, in this hand, we actually did get him to fold, so we don't see that at the moment, but he folds, and which is exactly what we want. I mean, essentially what I did is, if we just take a look at this on the surface, to win this pot, this 225 chip pot, standard procedure tells us we need to shove all in. We need to risk our 1,500 stack to win 225 chips, because you're not allowed to do anything other than push or fold with 10 big blinds. You're not allowed to do it. You do it, you know, you'll get burned at the stake. What I've done is I've risked 350 chips total to, or I should say, 300 more chips total to win the same pot. So, isn't that what we would rather do? Risk less to win the same amount? That's one of the other key points of this strategy as well, with just raising versus shoving from the small blind in this type of scenario, reg versus reg, pretty tight reg in terms of 3-betting stats. In the long run, I want to know, is this raise profitable, or am I just simply insane and this is stupid? So we can use this Cardrunners EV tool, and I already plugged it in, took a screenshot to save us some time here. So what I did is I made a replica of the scenario. 9-man game. I think it was a $22 buy-in. We'll get into that in a second. But as you can see here, if you follow my cursor, what I set up was my stack, and we're going to raise to 350, and with 9-4 suited. The big blind, I gave pretty much the same 3-betting range. Remember I said before, what's the difference between 3-betting ranges and all-in calling ranges? When I'm raising with 10 big blinds, he's got roughly 10 big blinds, and I raise, again, standard procedure tells us that he has to assume very minimal fold equity, because typically I shouldn't be raising with 10 big blinds, because if I'm raising with 10 big blinds and he shoves, I should be calling, or most people think that I'm going to be calling with most of the range that I raised with 10 big blinds. So the perceived fold equity is minimal. So given that, what I did was I said, you know what, I think in this situation his 3-betting range is going to equal his all-in calling range, because I don't think he perceives any fold equity in this situation. And that's not a difficult thing to assume. But we're going to take that assumption right now, that so it was any pocket pair, you don't see the whole thing, but it was any ace, king jack off, queen jack suited. I think that was pretty much the calling range. So that's what we made the 3-betting range as well. And whenever he doesn't pick up those hands, he's going to fold. So this Cardrunners EV program is essentially a decision tree it creates. We can find out the plus or minus EV of a certain play given the decisions of our opponents. So we raised to 350 with 9-4 suited. The big blind is going to raise with the same range he's going to call the all-in with, or 3-bet shove. Otherwise, he's going to fold, and accordingly, we're going to fold. We're never raise calling with 9-4 suited. So the question is it more profitable to actually raise fold with 10 big blinds? So after we ran the simulation, we want to look at this number here, and I popped it out a little bit here. Raise folding has a plus EV of 0.66%. If you remember, shoving was 0.25%. Okay, this is a calculation that should hopefully open your eyes a little bit to some other ways to play. Now, I want to step back real quick and say, well, what if his 3-betting range is wider? Again, I'm going to refer you back to Volume 4 of the Sit and Go series I did, because if we get into all these calculations again, one, it's going to be a little bit redundant, because I talked about it before, and two, it would make this video really long, and I want to get through some other strategies. So the questions you may be asking yourself is, one, what if he starts exploiting this? What if his 3-betting range is wider than his all-in calling range? Well, then the question is, how wide does it have to be to make this number here equal to or less than the shoving range? you'll be pretty shocked if you go back to Volume 4 about how wide that 3-betting range has to be to actually make this raise fold less profitable than the all-in shove. I think it has to go from like 23% to 35 or 36%. And that's a really, really wide 3-betting range. The only reason he would be doing that is if he knows for a fact you're doing this with any 2 cards, and he's capable of 3-betting you really wide because he knows you're going to fold. Most players are not capable of exploiting that. Okay? So, hopefully, I showed you this little strategy that if you're in 10 big blinds, and I use this, and again, in Volume 4, I'm going to keep referring you back to it, of the Sin Go series, this can be done profitably down to 8 big blinds, 7 big blinds even. I'm not a big fan of going even lower because then it really starts hindering your future equity as well. These calculations are for this moment in time. It doesn't calculate the future equity. So I don't like to go too low. 8, 9 big blinds is still very feasible to actually raise fold, and you're going to feel like an idiot raise folding with 8 or 9 big blinds. I don't care. You're making money if you're going to do it in the right spot. The key is to do this against ABC regs who are not 3-betting you wide. Maybe they're mass tabling. You identify a reg as mass tabling. They don't have time to 3-bet you wide and adjust to you. They're not capable of flatting. Don't do this play against random players that you have no stats against. This is very player dependent. If you start doing this against an unknown player or a fishy player and they're capable of flatting, doing weird stuff, this play gets blown out of the water. We don't want to do it. This is a very specific play so that when the opportunity presents itself, we can, we know what to do to exploit this scenario. I want to take this one step further and talk about the value of an optimal play and the value of missing out on it, essentially. As I mentioned before, if we're missing out on this plus dollar EV scenario, now that dollar EV number will change based upon whether it's a 6-max game, a 9-man game, an 18-man, a 180-man, whatever. The number doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is it the more optimal play compared to the alternative of shoving all in? And if it is, regardless of whether this number is 0.5, 0.6, as long as it's better than the other one, then that's the optimal play. So I want to take it one step further and say, how much money could we make, or how much money are you losing by not taking advantage of this? And as I said, it's magnified over all those tables you play given the frequency at which a simple small blind versus big blind scenario occurs. So let's check it out. So the shove versus raise. So we're going to compare the actual profitability of the all-in shove versus raising with 10 big blinds. So as we said before, the all-in was it was a 0.25% plus dollar EV when we shoved all in. That came from Sit and Go Wizard. And that means 0.25% of the prize pool. That's how much money you're going to make every time you make that play in the long run. The raise fold, as we just saw, was 0.66%. So if we look at real dollar figures, that in the long run, how much money are you going to make? If we say this is a $20 game with 9 players, the prize pool is $180. So 0.25% times 180. Every time you shove all in, you're going to make 45 cents in the long run. Every time you make that play. That's great. You're making money. That's how you get those upward graphs. That's how you just simply make money. But the question is, can we make more money? By me making this play and you shoving, am I making more money than you? The answer is yes. This is how guys can get really high ROIs in their game, is by adopting more of a raise fold scenario or raise call with the appropriate range. We're going to talk about raise fold because we had 9-4 suited, but we could start using those tools like the Cardrunners EV to say if his shoving range is X, we can call with Y. And I think in that scenario we should probably call with Ace-8, King-Queen suited, pocket threes plus. I think so. That'll increase the value of that play even more. So if we raise fold here with 9-4 suited, that's 0.66%. Times it by the prize pool. You're making 45 cents. I'm making $1.18 every time I make that play. That's real money, guys. That's real money in your pocket. That's where your ROI comes from. And if we can do this with 9-4 suited, the point of my calculation is Do it with any two cards now. You can do it with deuce 7. You know you can raise fold with 9-4. There's no difference between deuce 7. Raise with any two cards, and then call with the appropriate range. And again, go, as I said before, go to episode 4 of my Sit and Go series, and I go through a lot more calculations about what's our calling range, how wide can they 3-bet. That'll go into that a little bit more, but hopefully this will get you to think and really hone in on what you're doing in the small blind. Identify that player. When you identify the ABC reg, start raising with any two cards, guys. Hopefully this calculation will help you realize that there's more to just push folding. We don't just have to fold and give up either when we have a bad hand. We can start adopting more of a raise fold, raise call game. So hopefully that's clear. Let's move on to some other strategies versus different players. Oh well, first I got one of my favorite characters, Weebay. If anybody watches The Wire, best show on TV, or used to be the best show on TV. Hopefully get you thinking, and again get you out of that grumpy cat mode. And some guys, when I first introduced this strategy, they get defensive and say there's no way that can work. So I always say now, after doing the calculation, what you think now? I think it'd be really valuable to your game. So hopefully you are convinced as well. You're out of grumpy cat mode and can start opening your eyes a little bit more. And as I said, I think I've repeated this several times. Check out part 4 for more calculations. Let's get into another player type that I think gives us a lot of headaches because I don't think we play these types of players correctly at all. This is player type 2, the loose passive player. Now, who's a loose passive player? It's typically, if you look them up on SharkScope, they're a losing player. They don't understand sit and go strategy. If you look at their HUD stats, they're typically going to have like a 32-17, a 28-7, a 55-10, something absurd like that. And what that means is they're playing a lot of hands, they're pretty loose, but they're usually not raising. They're usually just calling raises or limping in. They're just very passive overall. So, if we know that about them, one thing we can determine that when we're in the small blind and we raise, they are capable of flatting, of course. And what really sucks is playing in the small blind, out of position versus one of these loose, passive calling station types of players. It can just get really, really nasty and can really cause headaches. But so many times I still see people just raising into them, because they don't know what else to do. Well, I've got 15 big blinds and I have king 9. I have to raise. Then he calls, then you're out of position. You're awkward stacks. You don't just have to raise. So what's our strategy? I don't think that raising to steal that pot is ideal anymore. If you have a good hand, sure, go ahead and raise for value essentially with a really good hand. But if you're holding something like Jack 10, even like 9-10, hands like that have some value, but even like King 9, something like that, playing out of position just gets a bit nasty. So let's use what we know against them, that they will call, but they're not going to raise. So, and I introduced this strategy in part 3 of the Sit and Go series. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking some topics from the Sit and Go series, put it into one blind versus blind specific video here, because I think blind versus blind play needs to be pounded into our brains because it happens so often, and I still think it's a little bit of a misunderstood or part of the game where we can definitely be playing optimal where a lot of people are not. So getting back to how we deal with the loose passive player, do the limp steal. And what we're going to do is, what that means is, we're going to just limp in. Okay, it's an unopened pot. We're just limping in. The point of limping in is essentially what I call the path of least resistance to steal the blinds. So the question is, how the hell are we going to steal when we're limping? Well, as we said, these guys are passive. They're not going to raise us. So if we limp, most of the time they're going to be checking, and that's great for us. Then what we can do is we can fire out pretty much a half pot size bet, 50%, half pot on any flop. We're not looking to hit our hand, guys. I'm going to do this with 9-4. I'm going to do this with King 9. I mean, the better hand that you have, that's nice that you could potentially hit something big as well, or get some value. But for the most part, I'm not looking to hit my hand. The point is, the guy in the big blind is going to miss the flop 2/3 of the time. So we want to bet half pot on every single time. Don't limp to hit your hand. Go ahead, bet half pot. I usually bet a little bit different than half pot so it doesn't look lazy. So if the pot's 200, for example, I might raise like 104 just to make it look like I thought about my bet. But that's the limp steal, the path of least resistance to steal that pot. So instead of raising, potentially playing out of position in an inflated pot, and with average stack sizes, which can be kind of awkward, do this limp steal. Now, one thing we're not going to get into today, but again, I'll refer you back to the Sit and Go series that I did for the 4 specifics is, well, what if he calls your flop bet? Oh no, sometimes that's where guys get lost. This will introduce some more post-flop play. It's okay. There's some great cash game videos here on Bluefire. Watch them on post-flop play, when to double barrel, when to give up. I did on part 5 of my Sit and Go series. I talked a little bit about post-flop play, when is a good time to double barrel. And so you need to be able to know when to double barrel, when not to in these situations. So watch some cash game videos, watch part 5 of the series. I also introduced the limp steal in part 3 where I go into some specific hands, I believe. We're not going to go into a ton of hands here because I would just keep showing you that I limp in, I raise, and then they fold, and all's right with the world. Again, I just want you to open your eyes and understand that. Look at the player, identify the player. If it's an ABC reg, we can raise. We don't really want to limp against them because they're probably going to raise over top of our weak play of limping. These guys, the loose passive ones, we can exploit them by limping and not necessarily stealing. And then, as I said, for some hand history examples of that, check out part 3. Now, another type of opponent. We did an ABC reg, your tighter opponents. We did the loose passive player. Let's get to some aggressive opponents. In general, aggressive opponents are the tougher ones to play against in the blind. Now, for a second, I'm going to lump randoms and regs into this discussion, but we're going to separate each in a second. Aggressive opponents, by nature, they're going to potentially call all-ins wider. They're going to 3-bet wider. Random players, the loose, fishy players, the losing players, even though they're aggressive, they are still capable of flatting. They're capable of spazzing out. They come in all shapes and sizes. They're going to do a lot of wacky stuff. So they can, we'll talk about how to deal with them in a couple minutes. Then you got regs. They're, as I mentioned before, their 3-bet versus steal will probably be greater than 10%. So they are looking to potentially exploit. Now, a reg who's a winning player and who's adopting more of this aggressive style, this looking to exploit type of style, they might be the better regs in your game. They're paying attention. They know ranges a little bit better than your ABC regs. They're looking to exploit. So you want to be careful of them. You definitely want to be careful of them. But that doesn't mean we can't exploit them either. Might be evolve several levels of thinking, but that's okay. That's how we have to get our edge. So, playing against regs, the strategy here is, or playing against aggressive regs, the strategy we want to use. Here's typically what I'll do first is, as we talked about with the ABC regs, when I have 8 to 12 big blinds, I still will look to play more of that raise fold, raise call strategy. Because even though they're aggressive, when you have 8, 9, 10 big blinds, aggressive or tight reg, they're still going to perceive minimal fold equity, which is key. So if they don't perceive much fold equity, their 3-betting ranges should still not be much wider than their all-in calling ranges. Where they become more aggressive is where they have more fold equity, or they think they have more fold equity, that 14, 15, 16 big blind area. That's where they might get really aggressive. So what I'm essentially going to do versus these guys, versus the regs, I still know they're not going to flat. I want to see what I can get away with. That's what I always want to do. Is how you sit at a table and maybe you identify guys aggressive reg. He's going to be in your big blind for the majority of the game. So figure out what you can get away with, and then go from there. And don't make an assumption until you know the specific range. So if you know a reg is 3-betting you wide, you will have a few options. But one thing I want to point out is you have to know that they're exploiting you. Just because they might 3-bet you once or twice, don't make the assumption now that, oh, he knows what I'm opening with, I'm going to have to fold now, he's exploiting me. Do not jump to that conclusion right away, guys. So many people say that to me when they adopt this type of strategy. They think that people know what they're doing all of a sudden, and they're going to start 3-betting you. But when we actually look back at their hands and identify the times where we saw their hand, it was still usually a pretty good hand, a value range of hands. It wasn't, Jack Deuce out of nowhere. You will find those guys that are capable of 3-betting and exploiting you. But the point is, you want to know first. That's the key. So, but if you do know, let's just say you identified a guy who is capable of 3-betting you wide. What can we do against them? Essentially, you can do a couple things. If you have less than 12 big blinds, and you think that every time you raise, they're going to 3-bet with a really wide range that will exploit those opens, then what we want to do is go back to unexploitable. Look to shove all in. Don't go to the raise fold anymore. Shove all in with the 12 big blind. Adopt that standard strategy that you're probably used to, and play unexploitable. When you have greater than 12 big blinds, look to tighten up your range, fold out the trash hands, maybe raise with your good hands. If you are resorting to raising in general, if greater than 12 big blinds, or maybe even in the 10, 11 big blind range. Now this number 3 here is a little bit more difficult because you're kind of taking a leap of faith, and you might be getting out of your comfort zone a little bit. But if somebody's 3-betting you wider, accordingly, if you want to, another way to exploit them is by widening your all-in calling range or your 4-betting range if you have 4-betting capabilities there. So that's a way to exploit. So if we were going to call the tight reg with ace-8, then maybe against this aggressive reg we widen that to ace-5 and king-jack and hands like that. So don't be afraid to widen your calling range if you know somebody's capable of 3-betting you wider. And accordingly, if you're going to adopt that raise to the concept of still raising into them than just plain unexploitable, is look to induce as well. If you know that they're capable of 3-betting wide, definitely look to induce them. Induce those wide 3-bets. So that's the aggressive reg. When we deal with randoms, typically they're more on the loose aggressive side. In my opinion, they're the toughest players to play against, blind versus blind, because you can't do, even though they're random players, you can't do the limp steal, because every time you limp, they're going to raise. They're going to raise way too often, so you're just going to waste chips. You can't open wide because they're capable of 3-betting, spazzing out, or flatting. As I said, they're capable of flatting, forcing you to play out of position, so that gets a bit nasty. So when I have 12 big blinds, I'm still going to raise with my value hands. Less than 12 big blinds, I'm probably just going to play push or fold with the appropriate ranges. I can't get into every range and every scenario because, again, that'll make this video several hours long. But that's typically going to be my strategy for playing against them. You want to play a very solid game, good ranges, solid hands. They're going to spew their chips on one way or another. You obviously want to be the beneficiary of those chips, but don't get too out of control. Play a very solid game against them. Now, with all this being said, there are, about players not being able to exploit you. We want to take a step back real quick and just talk about other things to take into consideration and how that can change your approach. Because small blind versus big blind play happens from the first hand and also in the money, 3-handed, for example. Now, all of those, I would probably need a whole other video to talk about each scenario. Pre-bubble, bubble, in the money. But we can talk about them, kind of a 30,000-foot view level, talk about the considerations you need to make and how your ranges should adjust. So, the things to keep in mind is that bubble play can change things. And by change things, I mean for players that understand ICM, especially ABC regs, the guys who we said aren't going to exploit us, this might be a situation where you actually get exploited, and that's on the bubble, especially if like a 9-man bubble, a 6-max bubble, an 18-man bubble, any situation where the bubble obviously means a lot. In a 180-man, the actual bubble isn't too big of a deal as compared to like a 45 or an 18-man, but a final table bubble, for example, means a lot because now you have a pay jump. So the only time these guys know to exploit your open is given the ICM and stack distribution of the situation. For example, if you're second in chips and an ABC reg and the big blind is the chip leader and there's short stacks at the table, it would be wrong of you typically to raise into that player because they're probably capable of 3-betting you with any 2 cards knowing you can't call on the bubble given ICM and the stack distribution without pocket aces or pocket kings or queens. So be careful on the bubble, and in situations where, given the stack distribution, you can get exploited, where you know you just simply can't raise call because it would be an ICM disaster. But the key concept there is that they're exploiting the situation, not you, the player. So that's another element to keep in the back of your mind. Don't all of a sudden assume that this tight ABC reg, that's who you identified, all of a sudden starts 3-betting you wide on the bubble. He's not exploiting you. He's exploiting the situation. But the first thing I want to know is he going to exploit that situation? So as I said before about dealing with like an aggressive reg, see what you can get away with. If they're not exploiting, then go ahead and exploit them. Resort to just playing a raise fold, raise call game until they exploit that strategy. And if they are exploiting, then you just have to maximize your fold equity and make unexploitable shoves because you don't want to get into raise call mode. Or just raise folding with a lot of your range because then you'll just be leaking chips. And that same concept goes for other exploitable scenarios, such as in the money, final table bubble, weird stack distributions. For example, in the money, you're in a 9-man, 3-handed, there's a chip leader, you're second in chips, and then there's a really, really short stack. Well, that one big blind stack, for example, is going to get knocked out soon. So if you're second in chips, don't look to be raising into the chip leader too often because he can exploit you by shoving any 2 cards. So that's kind of the overview of things to keep in mind about situations where you can be exploited. But outside of these parts of the game, pre-bubble, for the majority of the game when you're in blind versus blind scenario, when the opportunity presents itself with an ABC reg, with an aggressive reg, with a loose passive player, with a loose aggressive player, understand their player types, use what we know against them to start stealing. Okay? Because what I want you to do is, my conclusion, I've come to a lot of conclusions here. The key points that I want you to understand is identify the player in the blind and always look to exploit, because what I'm always thinking is there's a way to steal those chips. There's a way to get this pot. What's the best way to get this pot? Knowing what I know about that big blind. If he's a tight reg, well, I know he's not going to flat me, so I can then raise and with any 2 cards, and I can raise fold down to 8 big blinds. Okay. Essentially, I'm looking for the path of least resistance based upon the player. So should we raise with any 2 cards? Should we play more unexploitable and shove? Should we do a limp steal? It's all player based. Okay, all player based. What I'm trying to do here is arm you with the tools so that when the opportunity presents itself, you know how to exploit that scenario to steal that pot, instead of doing one of 2 things: either just playing to push fold mode, or just simply looking at your hand and saying and folding. Okay. Expand upon your game. You understand now, hopefully, especially in terms of raise folding, how much value that can add to your game and overall profitability and making money, because that's what the name of the game is, making money. So just stop auto folding in the small blind. Look to pick up the chips. Okay, guys? So in part 2, what I'm going to do is, now in blind versus blind play, naturally, we're going to look at big blind play. How to play when we're in the big blind and we have position now. It's going to be a little bit different. So I'll be take a look at that when it comes out, probably in the next 2 weeks. So I hope you've all enjoyed this. Take a look back at my sit and go series for further calculations and hand history examples of these different strategies. And also look at, I'll look at every video I've done. In a lot of the videos I do, I reference blind versus blind play very often in exploiting stats. I'm very big on exploiting, if you haven't figured that out by now. But the hand history reviews that I've done, usually the situations always come up. So be sure to review them, and hopefully you nail them for your own game. So I hope this will be helpful for you, and you go and start stealing out of the small blind more. Good luck, guys. See ya.